Hi everyone. So for today's class, what we're going to be doing is get into our first reading that represents an actual theory. So before, what we did is kind of read about theory in terms of what it is, how we'll approach it, how we should be thinking about it. And then today we'll use Machiavelli's piece as our first reading that actually represents a social theory. Now, it's a little bit before the formalization of the discipline in terms of sociological theory, but nevertheless, it's uh, kind of the first steps in terms of creating a new type of writing, the writing that ultimately became sociological theory. So Machiavelli's *De Prince* is a pretty famous book. You may have come across it in other classes, such as Western civilization classes, government classes, and maybe even other sociology classes as well. So, nevertheless, what we'll do is kind of break it down today in terms of what's going on, how it's going on, and exactly why it is that way for Machiavelli. So before we get into Machiavelli, this is to a brief recap of what we talked about for our last class. In our last class, the main goal was to introduce you to social theory. And we talked about theory as a few different metaphors. One metaphor being a lens, allows us to see the world in a new way. The other one was a tool that allows us to understand the world in a new way. And then also we talked about the idea of a theory as a river, how the early ideas will influence kind of the middle years and also influence contemporary new ideas as well. So there's a continuation of theoretical ideas from the past all the way to the present. So in addition to breaking down theory in terms of how we are going to approach it, we also talked about how we should read it. So reading theory, you really need to understand the context. And again, the context is twofold: the history in which the person is writing, and then also the kind of personal history, the biography of the individual who's actually doing the writing. And we'll touch on both of those things when we talk about Machiavelli. And then also we said it's important to recognize the theme of the theory. Generally speaking, what type of theory are we looking at? And so again, we'll kind of talk about that today with Machiavelli. Generally speaking, we're looking at a theory of social control. In addition, we'll kind of break things down in terms of that what, how, and why. So hopefully they'll start to make sense to you in terms of how we're going to think about theory. But also we talked about, we'll be discussing other things in terms of breaking down theory, specifically in the book reports, but also kind of along the way as well. We'll be looking at what's that driving force of reality, kind of relates to that why it is this way. And also we'll talk about structure and agency, elements that are kind of bigger than the person, social forces larger than the person. We call those social structures. And then elements of free will, we call those elements agency. And also the directional focus of the framework. Is there a framework trying to explain social life from the top down, a macro focus, or from the bottom up, a micro focus? So Machiavelli, the Prince, has this cult-like status because it nicely kind of parallels a lot of the principles of capitalism as a way to organize society. And Machiavelli is credited with the idea that the end justifies the means. So as long as you kind of achieve your goal, as long as you do what you wanted to do, then it doesn't really matter how you actually do it. So, what you want to do, the end, justifies how you do it, the means. And so that kind of ties into the Prince, a kind of a way of actually, controlling people and getting them to do what you want to do, ultimately achieving your personal or perhaps your group-based goal. So, in addition to kind of that cult-like status, through the parallels to capitalism, a lot of people may kind of relate Machiavelli to the rapper Tupac. Tupac had a record out that he kind of talked a lot about Machiavelli, and different ideas coming from Machiavelli and the Prince. So nevertheless, it's part of our popular culture, and it kind of has a cult-like status because a lot of people will use it to kind of justify, maybe not being the nicest people, but achieving what they want to achieve, nevertheless. So looking at the context, this is going on during the kind of early 1500s. And what we're looking at is the Italian Renaissance. And during this Italian Renaissance, as we label this time period, there are a lot of major social changes going on. And these social changes motivated Machiavelli to write The Prince. You had globalization with a lowercase g, kind of the first stages of globalization going on. People going to kind of different spaces to acquire goods, to trade goods. And then also he started to see for the first time new forms of technology emerging, such things as being able to print was coming to the forefront for the first time, and also new forms of war technology. And that kind of changed the game in terms of what you needed to win battles, what you needed to win wars. So in the past, you just needed numbers, basically, numbers and a decent strategy, and typically you could win the battles. But with new forms of technology, such as cannons, for example, the game really changes. You may not have the numbers, but you have the cannons, the technological force that can replace 20 different men. So we have these technological changes going on. And also what you have is the beginning of what we know today as nation states. So if you look at kind of old maps during what we call kind of pre-modern times, you have these large empires rather than these different kind of states, these different nations that we recognize today. So here's a time where these large empires were imploding, and in place were these smaller nation states. And so this is what Machiavelli was really focusing on. He was worried that, where he was at, that, their control, their rule was going to be kind of swept away into the past with history moving, and kind of him and his kind of colleagues that kind of helped rule over society, they're going to get swept away and they're going to lose their power. And so the reception of this book is something that people kind of refer to as some of the first empirical work. And by empirical work, we're looking at things that were actually going on that you can see in life. You're kind of observing what's going on, and you try to write about it as such. And, we're used to this today. But in the past, again, during the early 1500s, what we're looking at is most writings were spiritual writings, kind of, religious type writings that focused on the spiritual world, a world that you often can't see with your own eyes. You just kind of have to take for granted that it's there. And Machiavelli was one of the first pieces that you actually see somebody kind of writing about life as it is, kind of on the ground. And sometimes people misinterpret this as Machiavelli was trying to help the people being ruled, in terms of trying to help them see how people are trying to control them. And in actuality, as I mentioned, he was part of the ruling class, and he wanted to help the ruling class kind of make that transition into modern society and keep their power and keep their control. So recognizing the theme. So as I mentioned, you can see this book in a lot of different classes if you go to college. And when I was in college, I took a Western civilization class, and we had to read this. And so, it was an interesting read, but I really didn't understand it in terms of exactly the point of it, what he was trying to do, what it's really about in essence. So this is why kind of recognizing the theme helps us. And so the theme of this is a theory of social control. And specifically, as a theory of social control, he's trying to explain effective ruling. So basically, he's trying to explain how to be an effective ruler, how to control people, again, to make them do what you want to do, to ultimately achieve your personal goal with assistance of those people you look over, with assistance of those people that you control. So kind of that's the what, we're looking at the theory of social control. Specifically, he's trying to explain effective ruling. Now we can unpack, how he's explaining it. In other words, how one can be an effective ruler. So in the first part of your reading, he kind of raises this dilemma that, ideally you want your people to both fear you and love you at the same time. But he admits that that's an ideal that is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. And when he says you have to pick one or the other because you can't achieve both, he says it's better to be feared than it is to be loved. And he says when people fear you, that creates better obedience because they're worried about repercussions, they're worried about sanctions, they're worried about getting in trouble. Compared to when they love you, they kind of take that love for granted and say, well, if I kind of don't follow the rules, if I don't do what's asked of me, he or she's not going to do anything as a result because, they love me too much, they like me too much. So I'll be able to get away with it without any negative consequences. And so that's why he says it's better to be feared than loved because it creates a better obedience because people are scared of negative consequences if they don't follow your rule compared to if it's love that you're using to rule them, then often they're not scared of negative consequences because those negative consequences may not be there to begin with. So he says this, you want to be feared rather than loved if you want to be an effective ruler. But he says the number one rule is you want to avoid people hating you. And so he says, fear is good, but there's a line that you can cross where they don't fear you anymore, they actually just begin to hate you. And when people begin to hate you, they will turn on you, no matter what the consequences may be. It doesn't matter anymore. That hatred kind of creates a different type of emotional state in people being ruled, and they will revolt. They will turn against you. And I always think of a basketball coach that I had in high school that he tried to be very heavy-handed in terms of coaching us, and worked to a certain degree. But a point came during the season that we were in our locker room, and he kicked the trash can, and accidentally the trash can bounced off the wall and actually hit one of our players, like the nicest kid on the team, hit him in the head. And so that kind of was the point where people started to say, I'm not scared of this guy anymore. He's kind of a jerk, and I simply don't like him. And a lot of players actually decided to quit the team. Some former players wrote a letter to the editor. Long story short, the coach retired, and it all came because people stopped fearing him and started to hate him more as a coach. So that's what Machiavelli is kind of getting at in terms of how you want to be an effective ruler. Kind of step one, you want people to fear you, but you don't want them to hate you. And in addition to that, we can recognize that Machiavelli says to be an effective ruler, you have to honor one's word, but you want to do so lightly. So here he says you have to be very good at communication, very good with speaking, always make people feel that they're cared for, like they matter. Always kind of say what they want to hear, but always leave yourself out. Don't ever get yourself in a corner where your words can come back to haunt you, or you can be caught in a lie. So he says, use your words lightly because you're never going to get trapped in a lie, as people start to see you as kind of a phony and perhaps turn against you. Be a good liar. So again, when you are lying, kind of do it in a way where, you kind of have that out where, if you look at it one way, yes, it's a lie, but I didn't want you interpret it that way. So, I meant something else. So you kind of, okay, maybe you weren't lying. Just it depends on the interpretation. So, be good with your words, be a good liar, and don't get caught in a lie. And here he also talked about kind of always having a greater good, kind of a greater cause. So you're not trying to control people for your personal well-being, but some type of larger cause. It's for the country, it's for, the kids or whatever. It's not about you, it's about some kind of greater good. And so that kind of deflects maybe your personal motivations behind your rule to something else. And people don't see it directly on you, but part of a larger picture. So finally, we can say that in addition, if you want to be an effective ruler, in addition to being feared rather than loved, but not being hated, to being good with your words, being a good communicator, he says you have to have both the fox and the lion. So here, a couple different symbols, just like the prince. The prince is symbolic for any person in a position of rule. The prince is symbolic for anybody in a position of authority. And so here we see another two symbols. He says, an effective ruler has to be both the fox and the lion. And here the fox represents kind of a mental strength, kind of a street smart, so to speak, where you can get people to do what you want them to do without even asking them. So kind of using your mind, being very cunning, like a fox, you can be an effective ruler. People are jumping before you even ask them to jump. But in addition to that, sometimes, you can't outsmart everybody in terms of being an effective ruler. So here is the metaphor or the symbol of the lion, in the sense that you need to have that physical strength along with a mental strength. And so here, it's not necessarily about you personally being a strong person, but you having a kind of strong force behind you, whether it be an army, some type of police force. So you have this kind of strong strength behind you if you need to use it. So overall, again, the theme is the theory of social control. He's trying to explain how to be an effective ruler. You can be an effective ruler when you have the mental strength and the physical strength, when you're good with your words, when you're good at communicating, and when people fear you but don't hate you. So why is it this way? So what's that driving force in the framework for Machiavelli? Basically, he believes that people can't be trusted. People are kind of bad by nature, they're fickle, and they'll turn on you when it suits their interest. And that's why you have to rule in these ways. So, you can't try to rule through love, or you can't just try to be honest with people all the time, because people will turn on you if they believe it suits their best interest. So because he believes that people are kind of bad by nature, this is why he says being an effective ruler is A, B, and C. And you can find that on page 9 of the reading. So that's how we can look at Machiavelli, the Prince, kind of as a social theory and break it down as such. And what I like to do is kind of apply the theory, as a lens and as a tool to kind of help us understand why these metaphors are useful. So you can look at these 3 images here I have on the slide. And the first image, if you look at it, basically what you're going to see is somebody who looks a bit rough and tough. It's actually a former leader of the Hells Angels motorcycle group. And here you can look at it as such, but if you want to kind of re-see it through the lens of Machiavelli as a prince, you can see it as somebody who's trying to invoke fear. He's not trying to make anybody love him. He wants people to fear him. And as such, he can be a more effective leader. In the same thing, we can look at the next 2 images, President Clinton and President Bush. And, we look at them at face value, the images basically are people talking, communicating. But we can, again, use the theory as a lens to re-see these things in terms of Machiavelli's The Prince. And when we do so, we see people being very crafty with their words. So when, Bill Clinton was going through the kind of different trials and tribulations with Monica Lewinsky, he says, I did not have, I did not, have sex with Monica Lewinsky, or whatever he said. I did not have sexual relations with her. That's what he said. And so on the one hand, you could say he's lying if you consider, oral sex. But on the other hand, he's not lying, because some people don't consider, that form of sex to be sexual relations. And the same thing can be applied to President Bush's mission accomplished speech. When he gave this mission accomplished speech, the mission was not over yet. But he was only talking about kind of a small portion of the overall mission. So again, he's not really lying if he's only talking about one piece, but he was lying if he talked about kind of the entire mission as a whole. So that's what Machiavelli says, be very crafty with your words and always kind of lead yourself with a way out. And so you're not going to be caught in a lie. So again, we can look at these three images at face value. We see a couple ex-presidents talking. You see kind of a rough and tumble guy. But if you kind of re-see them through the lens of social theory, you can see them in a new way. And the same thing in terms of the metaphor as a tool. We start to understand now why this person is trying to be rough and tough rather than have everybody really like him and love him, because it's a better control mechanism. We can understand better why President Bush and President Clinton are kind of using the words very carefully, because again, that helps them be a more effective ruler overall. So you see things in a new way, but you start to understand them in a new way as well. Now, overall, we talk about relevance of this. So although written in the early 1500s, you can say that it still is relevant today. You can look at a coach on a sport team, like I talked about. You can look at a parent and how he or she is parenting a child. You can look at a teacher. And all three of these people hold positions of power at home, in the classroom, on the field. And because they represent a person in a position of power trying to rule effectively, we can apply Machiavelli's The Prince to it. And we start to see, why a parent parents in a certain way. Sometimes a parent will say, this hurts me more than you, but I have to do it for your own good. Sometimes we see a parent who just tries to be a kid's friend more so than their father or mother. And then the parenting itself doesn't really turn out too well. And so you can start to understand things a little bit differently when you use Machiavelli's lens, when you use Machiavelli's theory as a tool. Why a coach coaches in a certain way, why a teacher teaches in a certain way. Also you could recognize if nobody listens to the coach, if nobody listens to a parent or to a teacher, perhaps because they're not following Machiavelli's guidelines in terms of how to be an effective ruler. So we'll leave that there when it comes to Machiavelli. For our next class, we're going to shift into classical theory. So here's the formalization of social theory, where sociological theory first emerges as a formal discipline. And when we look at classical theory, we're going to start by looking at Marx and Engels. So we'll get into that more next class, and I'll leave that there. As always, if you have any questions, please get in touch, and I'll see you next time.